Welcome, friends. Thank you so much for joining this session. I'm Bridget Moix, Assistant Clerk of the General Committee, and this is our first of a number of sessions on diversity, equity, and inclusion during this annual meeting. I am so happy to be here with our consultant, Lisa Sharon Harper from Freedom Road, who I will introduce in just a moment. We have been doing work, as you know, for a number of years on improving our diversity and inclusion and equity within the General Committee, within FCNL's work, within our staff across the whole organization. And this is a very important journey for us, and it's been a really important year. And we're really glad to continue this work with the General Committee here during annual meeting. As you know, annual meeting is a time of joy. It's a time of coming together as a community. And we love being here with all of you. I've loved seeing so many faces on the screen of dear friends. But it has also been at times for people a time of pain. And there have been moments when the beloved community we've tried to create has cracked a bit for some of us. And so the work we're doing with annual meeting now to really dig into what does it mean to embrace diversity, to embrace inclusion and equity and change for our community, change for our world. This is really important work, and I'm so grateful that you're here with us for it. Right now, we're going to have a session with Lisa Sharon Harper. She's going to speak to us, help educate us and inform us. This is not a time for questions and comments right now. It's a time to receive, to listen deeply, and to reflect over the coming hours and days together. There will be sessions later this evening. There's a caucus session. Caucus groups will gather at 6 p.m. And that will be a time to reflect back on what you hear now, and join together with others in further exploration and discussion. And there'll be other sessions later on in the annual meeting schedule as well. So thank you so much, Lisa. It's a joy again to be with you. You've been with us for a number of months now and helping move us through this important work. For those who don't know Lisa yet, you can see her bio briefly in the program. She's a speaker, she's a writer, she's the president and founder of Freedom Road. And if you have not yet read any of her writings, I really do encourage you to Google her, order her books, look at her articles in Sojourners and elsewhere. You will be inspired, I promise. Lisa, we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Bridget. Really do appreciate that. We are living right now in a world where there's no way that we can move forward into that and lean into that beloved community that Bridget talked about just a moment ago. And I'm sure, and actually it's the force of love is what this particular Friends Committee on National Legislation annual meeting is all about. You can't talk about love in America or in any post-colonizing nation without talking about the construct of race in particular, because that construct is something that is embedded so deeply in the national and legal fabric of our nation, the historical and legal fabric of our nation, the social fabric of our nation. And it permeates every single thing. That if we don't address this one thing, we will not be doing the work of leaning into the beloved community. So we have to understand race. And that is what we're here to do today. We're also going to talk about the implications of this with regard to the choice that FCNL has made in order to lean into the question of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and then how we are going to live that out in this year's annual meeting. Okay, are we ready to go? We're ready to go. Okay, great. So next slide, please. So let's talk about these four categories that are often confused. They're often interchanged, but they are not interchangeable. So we want to get some clarity. First, we're going to talk about ethnicity. Ethnicity is the different ethnic groups, the different groups of people who have traveled across land and over time together, over long periods of time. And that Time and space has shaped them in particular ways. It has given them common issues, if you will, because they had to deal with common things. It's given them common strengths because they've had to exercise common muscles. It's given them common ways of understanding the world because they have had common experiences that have shaped their worldview. That's what ethnicity is. That's what an ethnic group is. It's the difference between Irish American and Irish in Ireland. The whole experience of coming to America actually creates a whole new ethnic group in America because they had common experience together in America that is different from that of those who stayed back in Ireland. Same thing for African American or Nigerian. Different ethnic groups, or even Yoruban versus Hausa in Nigeria, right? So these are different ethnic groups with different being shaped by time and space together. That's ethnicity. Next slide, thank you. Culture. Culture is fluid. Culture depends on the lived environment that you live in, because lived environment shapes culture. So if you live by the sea, you're going to be eating a lot of fish. And if you live by in the mountains, most likely you're going to be eating a lot of meat, and you're also going to build with wood because there's a lot of wood there. But if you live in the desert, you're likely going to be living in adobe, and your instruments that you use to create your music are going to actually look different than the instruments that are used in Siberia, because the lived environment produces different things to create those instruments from. You understand? The same thing is different from city to rural to suburban. Those lived environments create different cultures. So that's culture. And culture is fluid. There is African American in the city, African American in the country. There's Southern African American, and there's Denver African American. You know what I mean? So culture is fluid. Okay, next slide. Nationality. Nationality is just simply, what passport do you have? Which nations claim you as their citizen? Okay. So next slide. That's nationality. Very simple. Now let's talk about race. Now, race it was actually created by humans. We are the ones who created this thing called race. And this thing called race exists to do one thing, and that is to determine who was called by God or who was created with the call to exercise stewardship of particular land, particularly colonized land. All right, so in order for us to understand this, we have to understand the history of like where all this comes from. So let's go ahead and look at the history. Next slide. So the history of race, you have to take it all the way back to Plato. Plato's Republic, 360 BC. In 360 BC, Plato got this idea. He was actually writing the Republic, which is his pontification on how the Republic should work. How should we be living together in the empire? And so he said race is the different metals that different people groups are made of. Some people are made of gold, others are made of silver, others are copper and bronze, and whatever metal they are made of is what determines how they will serve the Republic. Hello, somebody. So what you have in this very first foundational iteration of this thing that we call race in the Western civilization, in the canon of Western civilization, was originally conceived to order society, to help order the Republic. Now, it's debatable whether or not this was hierarchical at the time, but it did not take long. 10 years later, Aristotle, Plato's student, next slide, Aristotle wrote on interpretation. He was trying to figure out, what does it mean to be human? What makes someone human? Now, scholars who have studied Aristotle understand and have talked about the fact that when Aristotle thought of what it meant to be a human being, what would have been in his mind would have been white, male, and able-bodied. So Aristotle was the very first one to coin the term Western supremacy. Western supremacy. So that comes 10 years after Plato. Now, Aristotle was not the last person to take this up and run with it, right? So now we have to flash forward. We're going to flash forward about 1,000 years to the next slide, Pope Nicholas V. Pope Nicholas V is approached by an explorer in 1454, and this explorer says, "Hey, Pope, I'm going to go exploring. I need a blessing." Now, this explorer was actually a friend of his family, and he said, "Hey, I'll give you a blessing, no problem. In fact, I'll do you one better. I will give you the right to claim the land that you land on if it is not civilized, and to enslave its people." And that's what we come to understand to be the doctrine of discovery. That doctrine was embedded first in the Romanist Pontifex and then embedded into law, and it became the legal basis by which we got all of North, Central, and South America, all of colonized Africa, all of Australia, when you look at Vietnam, when you look at Hong Kong, when you look at India, wherever there was colonization, one of the pieces of law that they drew from was Romanist Pontifex, was the doctrine of discovery. So that doctrine of discovery actually was conceived, it was ill-conceived because it was conceived from a bad read of the very first page of the Bible, of Genesis 1:26, where it says, those who are made in the image of God are created to exercise dominion in the world. But see, what that Pope did was he conceived of the only ones who were created in the image of God were those who were civilized, right? And his understanding of civilization was pretty much shaped by Aristotle, who came, before here. Had to be white, had to be male, had to be able-bodied, and according to the Pope, also had to be Christian. So here is where we begin to see the intersections of all the things with white supremacy. White supremacy has embedded in it religious supremacy. It has embedded in it cultural supremacy. And now when you go forward about another 200 years, next slide, you're going to see Elizabeth Key. Now, Elizabeth Key was a young girl who lived on the other side of the river from Jamestown around the same time, a little bit after Jamestown was formed in 1608. Now, 1608, we know that's Jamestown. Their original founders were around for a while, and one of them had Elizabeth Key. Elizabeth Key was his daughter, his half black and half white daughter. He was a British citizen, and he had her baptized. Now, here's the deal. According to the law, she should not have actually been able to be enslaved because English common law traced the citizenship of the children through the line of the father. And English common law said you can't enslave another English citizen. And English common law said you can't enslave a Christian. Also going back to that Christian supremacy thing. Well, Elizabeth Key said, wait a minute, my dad is an English citizen, which means I'm an English citizen, which means I shouldn't be able to be enslaved. And by the way, I'm baptized. And so she took her case to court and she won. She won. And she was not the last to win. There were many who came after her and took their cases to court. And as they did, they continued to win. Now, remember, the ones who owned those slaves, who owned those people, were actually also the legislators. They were the people who kind of formed the whole colony. And they decided, you know what, in order to stem the tide of people we have to release from labor, from free labor, let's change the status of citizenship so that it no longer goes through the line of the father, but now, next slide, goes through the line of the mother. And this they did in 1662, when they established the very first race law that was established in the colonies. And this law said that from now henceforth, the citizenship of the child shall be traced through the line of the mother. And whatever the mother is, the child will be in perpetuity for all generations. So through this law, what they did was they established race-based slavery. They also established the incentive to rape their enslaved women, because now they could do it with impunity, and also cede for themselves free labor in perpetuity. So that was 1662. Next slide. So flash forward about 100 years, 1767, you get Carl Linnaeus. Now, he's a Swedish botanist. He's the guy who discovered kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, right? So I love that. I still remember it, seventh grade science. That's Mr. Williams. He was really good. But Carl Linnaeus was not alone in this, but we're highlighting him just for the purposes of having one person we can focus on here. But he was a scientist among many in this time who was actually beginning to ask the question, well, if this taxonomy of fauna works, maybe it works with humanity. Let's try it. So who did he put on top? He put himself on top. He said, on top are, well, this is literally what he called it, white Europeanus. White Europeanus. And under that, he had red Americanus. And under that, he had yellow Asiaticus. And under that, he had black Africanus. So here we have now gone from philosophy to religion to law to science. And it didn't take long at all to go from that to 20 years later. Next slide, we get the 3/5 compromise. And with the 3/5 compromise, we see it now embedded into the United States Constitution. This understanding of a taxonomy of human belonging, a hierarchy of human belonging. And this was a compromise between the North and the South in order to create parity, is what they called it, within those two regions for congressional representation, because there were very few white people in the South. And so as a result, they decided to count the people of African descent, but only as 3/5 of a human being. That was the Northern Compromise, towards the congressional delegations that the South had. So now you have it all embedded into everything. Now, flash forward just 3 years. Next slide. You have the very first census. And in that first census, we are not even any longer 3/5 of a human being. Now we are just simply things. In fact, we now appear on the slave schedule. And there's only one race that's actually mentioned on that first census, and that is white. You see, everything in America, all of the categories revolve around that one established race, whiteness, white. So on the census, what you'll see is you will see white free, white male, white female, other free, and then slave. That was the very first census. In that same year, same Congress, first Congress, you have the Naturalization Act of 1790. Next slide. And in that Naturalization Act, they said, if you don't get it, we're going to make it plain for you. The only people who can become naturalized citizens in the United States are white men. And later it says of good character, which basically meant Christian. So why would they do that? Why does naturalization matter? I hope you see there is an intersection between race and citizenship and hierarchy in the United States, and also gender. You see it all come together in this document, the Naturalization Act of 1790. Why does it matter? Because those who can be naturalized own it. Those who can be naturalized have the ability to exercise agency, full agency. Those who can be naturalized have the ability to establish and shape the way that we will live together as a polis. How? At the very least, through the vote. So this matters. And friends, this next slide is the struggle that we have been in from the very beginning of the founding of our nation. The question that we have been struggling against is, who is created to rule? And who is created to be ruled in this land? Next slide. This is the struggle of the Cherokee Trail of Tears and all of the removals of the native peoples from their land. Next slide. This is the struggle to free human beings from slaveocracy. Next slide. This is the struggle of Jim Crow and peonage. Next slide. This is the struggle against the Chinese Exclusion Act. Next slide. This is the struggle for women's suffrage. This is the struggle, next slide, for the Japanese internment camps. This is the struggle, next slide, of the Bracero program. This is the struggle, next slide, of the Zoot Suit riot, when sailors came off the ships in Southern California and beat those fine dressed Mexican-American men who had on their zoot suits and stripped them bare, naked, left in the public square. Why would they do this? Because they were struggling against the call and the capacity of all humanity to exercise stewardship of the land. And this is the struggle of the civil rights movement. Next slide. And this is the struggle, next slide, of the LGBTQIA movement in the United States. Next slide. And this is the struggle, next slide, of the environmental justice movement in the United States against having people dump toxic agents into our land because they can, because the poor and people of color they have no power to be able to fight back against having early deaths from cancer and heart disease and asthma. And next slide. This is also the struggle for full access to flourishing for people with disabilities. And friends, next slide. It all comes from the same place. Next slide. From the same source. Right now. Next slide. 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 Right now. Our underlying beliefs about the world and ourselves and how God relates to us and others and who we really value is all being revealed. We are in a time, my friends, where people of European descent right now make up 59.7% of the United States population. But within 25 years, by the year 2045, those of European descent will drop below 50%. And demographer Dudley L. Preston wrote recently in January 2020, this year, he said, on January 1st of this year, on the first day of this year, whites under the age of 18 were already in the minority. Already, among all the young people now in the United States, there are a minority of young people that descend from Europe. So, honey, it's here. It's right here. Now, Robert P. Jones, the author of White Too Long, explains that the perceived external threat of racial and cultural change primed white Christians for receptivity to Donald Trump. He says, in the course of a single political campaign, Donald Trump converted white evangelical value voters into nostalgia voters. Now, the thing that you have to understand about this is that while white evangelicals might actually hold that pocket the strongest, they're not the only ones. In fact, it's really permeated across all religious groups. Within almost all religious groups, what you find is that the majority of people of European descent hold these same views. Lest you think that, right? So they asked 2,500 adults living in all 50 states, do you long for the 1950s? And the majority of all white Americans who answered that survey said yes, while the vast majorities of people of color said no. We were like, no, thank you very much. Why? Because the 1950s was Emmett Till for us. The 1950s was redlining for people of color. The 1950s was before the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and the Immigration Act of 1965 and the Clean Air Act. It was in 1950s, 59% of people of African descent were living below the poverty line. Do we long for the 1950s? No. Now, next slide. I had a profound thought, and the screen is blank for a reason. I had a profound thought recently. I thought to myself, I tried to think back to that moment, that era when people of European descent would go out into the rest of the world and they would not imagine themselves having been created to rule it. When was that time? When was the time when people of European descent did not imagine themselves as being created to lead everyone else? Think with me, think back. When was that day? Now, I know there have been periods interspersed, and I'm not saying that white people have ruled the world, because they haven't. Many, many spaces that they have never actually ruled. But wherever they went, they approached that territory as if they were the ones called to rule it. So that's the question is, when was there a time when that wasn't true for people of European descent? Well, what I found when I thought about it long and hard is I had to go back before the Greek Empire. Next slide. The Greek Empire. I had to go back to the time before, about 3,000 years ago. So it's been 3,000 years, friends. 3,000 years that the various empires and people groups that have come up through Europe have been imagining themselves as those who were created to rule wherever they were. 3,000 years. Next slide. We have a choice to make. We have a choice to make. We are now coming into an age, for the very first time in American history, and I dare say it's a situation in the world, because the most powerful nation in the world is the United States of America. And within 25 years, people of color will be the primary people making decisions about how this most powerful nation in the world is led and leads. So the choice that we have to make in this moment is this. Will we war with each other for supremacy? Or will we, next slide, embrace the beloved community? Lean into it. This is a painting by John August Swanson. He's an artist from Southern California. And in it, if you look really closely, you'll see the words of Psalm 85, verses 10 and 11 kind of etched into the landscape with the sun and in the landscape itself on the horizon. And when you read Psalm 85, this is the part that it's reading from. Steadfast love and kindness, steadfast love and faithfulness will meet. Righteousness and peace will kiss each other. Faithfulness will spring up from the ground, and righteousness will look down from the sky. Is that not powerful and beautiful, a beautiful vision? Well, when we translate those words, steadfast love, that actually means, literally, it means kindness. And that word faithfulness, I would have thought it meant like, holiness or something, but it doesn't. It actually means truth, truth-telling, or trustworthiness. And the word righteous there actually means equity. Righteous doesn't mean pure, it means equitable. And peace there in the Hebrew is the word shalom, which really means it all. It's an encompassing of restitution and reparation and redemption and truth-telling and parity and all the things, all wrapped up into one. And so what this text is actually saying is that there will be a day when kindness and trustworthiness will meet, when equity and reparation and restitution and redemption will kiss each other, when faithfulness or truth-telling will spring from the ground, when justice will look down from the sky. And in that day, it says, this is what it says, the Lord will give what is good, and our land will yield its increase. Justice will go before God and will make a path for God's steps. Now, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had another way of communicating this vision. Next slide, he had the beloved community. In the beloved community, the King Center explains it this way, that Dr. King's beloved community is a global vision in which all people can share in the wealth of the earth. In the beloved community, poverty, hunger, and homelessness will not be tolerated because international standards of human decency will not allow it. Racism and all forms of discrimination, bigotry, and prejudice will be replaced by an all-inclusive spirit of sisterhood and brotherhood. So what do you see here? What do you see about the beloved community that Dr. King drew? It's really become a civic vision of shalom. It's become our civil vision of civil society of shalom. What I see is I see a global vision, one that encompasses all. I see that it is for all people, not just certain people, not just people in my religious sect. It is actually about wealth sharing. It is about power sharing. It is about having standards of human decency that we are accountable to. So that when the UN created the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that was our international standard of human decency that we decided to abide by. And I think it's amazing that it's actually built in here, and it is something that helps us to move, to lean into and create boundaries on our cray-cray. Boundaries on the ways that we just wanted to have our own way. But you can't have your own way if it's going to cause harm to someone else. And it's all inclusive. All are my sister. All are my brother, according to the beloved community. Now, next slide. Have you ever been on the beach? Okay, people. Have you ever been on the beach? And have you had a moment on the beach where you were standing in the water? And when you did not move your feet, and you were standing there, and you look up about 15 minutes later, and you realize you're further down the beach, but you have no idea how you got there because you did not move your feet. You're good. How did you get 15 minutes down the beach? That's called undertow. And the undertow is what draws us from the beloved community. The undertow, we could do nothing and find ourselves moving away from the beloved community. Now, about a month ago, I met with, maybe about like 2 or 3 weeks ago, I met with general committee members in order to discern how do we get drawn away from the beloved community. So I'd like to show the next slide. In this slide, you'll see their own self-discernment about the ways that they're drawn from the beloved community, particularly when we start talking about issues of white supremacy, when we start talking about issues of equity or justice or diversity. These are the places that we go, right? That with particularly within the people of European descent among the general committee, this is where they self-reported that they go. Exhaustion. Y'all, I'm exhausted. I don't want to deal with it, right? I already know that. You don't need to tell me anything, right? So defensiveness, which is, it goes along with the I already know that, right? So fear, anger, projection, colorblindness, the capitalism piece. I'd actually say I'd modify that just to say that it's really like leaning on any one particular economic system. Because we can make a God out of any economic system, capitalism as well, right? So retreat, despair, shame. I can't right now. I just can't, right? Ignorance or the inability to see how we are affecting others. Ego and pride, right? We can let our ego kind of get in the way of actually allowing ourselves to lean into the beloved community. But you see here in this diagram, the beloved community is in the center. And we get drawn away from that center into these things that draw us like magnets into other ways of interacting with each other that are powered by these other powers, fear, defensiveness. And I'll explain the spirit of 50-50 is there because it's one that I've run into a lot, and I shared it with the group. It's the spirit of we're all equally to blame, right? There's equal blame to go around. Well, friends, not always. Not always. So FCNL as an organization is looking toward its future. It understands the changing demographic. It understands that it is an historically European descent organization. It understands that its roots spring from very particular ethnic and cultural experience within Europe. It also understands that to remain relevant in our profoundly shifting world, FCNL must engage in a profound interrogation of its ways of doing things, its assumptions about the right ways, and begin to adopt processes and standards that lead to the renunciation of all forms and practices that stem from the soil of white supremacy or Western supremacy, and that embrace truth and trustworthiness and equity in its inward processes as much as it does in its outward processes. In short, FCNL is choosing to lean into the beloved community. Now, next slide. Moving toward the beloved community at the annual meeting is going to require of us some reshaping of how we do things in order to create those standards. The very first standard that we put in place that you should have seen when you signed up or when you received your registration is the community agreement. The community agreement was designed by the General Committee, particularly the Executive Committee of the General Committee, and is still a work in progress. But it's something that we've decided that we agree to interact in this way as we come into this space. And this will create for us not international standards of decency, but annual meeting standards of decency, standards of how we will protect each other in this space. We've also instituted process facilitators who are going to help us to cling close to the beloved community, to cling close to the community agreement so that we can keep from being drawn by the undertow into microaggressions or biases that we may not even be aware of, right? And those process facilitators are experts. They know what this stuff is about, and they also love you. We are here to serve. And the last is caucus groups, and then also on evaluation, and I believe also incident reports. There's going to be an opportunity for us to gather together in our different various caucus groups. We have a caucus group for people of European descent. Next slide. The General Committee. We'll get back to the caucus groups really quick. So this is the community agreement. So the community agreement, you will see these are the top line agreements for the community agreement. We agree to respect each other. We agree to be honest. Hello. And I highly recommend, go back to that last slide that you were on, the community agreement. Thank you. I highly recommend that you go back and you read it, because if you don't read it, you're going to be kind of lost throughout the time. So make sure you do. We agreed to be non-judgmental. And what that means, it doesn't mean that we won't be discerning. What it means is that we will approach people with the full canon of our experience of them, and that we will allow them to have their process. And at the same time, we will be discerning about whether or not something is injuring us. The community agreement is meant to protect us all from injury, not necessarily from disagreeing, but from injuring each other. Trustworthiness. We will be trustworthy with each other. We will be self-aware. We will hold empathy for each other. We will approach each other with agape kind of love, the kind of love that says, I'm not going anywhere. The kind of love that says, I'm here. I love you, period. And also we will approach each other seeking to know each other better, understanding we only come together once or twice or 3 times a year. And so because of that, we have limited knowledge of each other, but we're going to lean into knowing each other in this space. We're going to be curious. We're going to be caring. We're going to have, I love these two put together, unshockable persistence. In other words, I'm not going to be shocked by you. We've seen it all. Come on, we've seen a lot. And at the same time, we're going to move beyond being Quaker nice. And we're going to allow ourselves to shock each other. We're going to allow ourselves to say things that are hard to hear. And I love that the General Committee, the Executive Committee, decided to keep both of those in the community agreement. And we will be supportive. We will commit to be brave in this space. Okay, next slide. Now you can go to the next one. So the process facilitators have three major roles in their work with you together. A word about conflict. One might be concerned that this process will cause more conflict. It's not going to cause conflict. It's going to name the conflict that's in the room. The conflict is already there, friends. We see it as we see, the notes from previous annual meetings. It's there, but usually it's absorbed into the bodies of the people of color or those who identify on the margins with more marginalized or less resourced communities. Now, what we're doing is we're actually letting people see that the conflict is there. And we are going to commit to trusting each other enough to lean into the call to the beloved community and the community agreement and to recognize that that is there and to work through it. So it's your choice. And the process facilitators are here to help us to get there. So their role is threefold. One, to briefly introduce the community agreement and the guidelines for engagement at the top of every session. Two, to call friends back to the community agreement and the guidelines if and when necessary. When folks start to stray, when folks find themselves, being drawn by the undertow of anger, the undertow of indifference, the undertow of judgment, the undertow of 50-50. When we see that happening, we're going to draw us back. Okay, guys, let's go back to the community agreement. Where can we find help to come back to the beloved community in the community agreement? And then finally, if there are friends that just find it really and like it's going to be super hard for folks to abide by the community agreement, well, then we're going to abide by the community agreement and by our process and invite them just to step outside of the meeting until they can come back and abide by the community agreement. That's how we're going to continue to keep protected space in this time. Next slide. And the caucus groups, we'll go back to that. We have 3 caucus groups that will be meeting tonight from 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and then again on Monday from 4:20 to 5:20 Eastern time. They are the People of Color Caucus Group, the LGBTQIA+ Caucus Group, and the People of European Descent Caucus Group. And then finally, on Monday evening, we'll have an optional time because we figured there might be a need for some extra time, particularly among the people of color and those who identify as LGBTQIA, and also those who identify as disabled, to come together to process then. That processing on Monday, all of the processing on Monday, will be in light of what are we experiencing in our world. The processing tonight will be in response to this presentation and our conversation around the beloved community. Our caucus leaders will be myself. I'll be working with the People of Color group. Reverend Dr. Diane Johnson will be working with the LGBTQIA+ group. And Alexi Laushkin will be working with the People of European Descent group. Next slide. So we recognize that there are enough changes in this year's structure that you likely feel the changes. I know you do. You must. Not to mention that we're also viral or virtual. And all of these structures, plus the feedback loop on your evaluation, have been put in place to help us to reach toward that beloved community. Form determines function. How a space is structured determines what is possible in that space. So we have worked hard with the annual meeting team to help structure a space that will challenge us. It will stretch us. It will be uncomfortable for some. And yet change is never comfortable. But we know that these changes are giving you an opportunity to experience a taste of the beloved community. And when you find yourself caught in that undertow, pulled away from the beloved community, I want to ask you to do this. Lean in to the community agreement. Have that community agreement at the ready and go to it and see which of the points can help you find your way back to beloved community. Let the Spirit speak to you in your worship times. Listen deeply in your caucus groups. Honor the process facilitators. That is your path back to the beloved community over the next 4 days. This is the vision. This is the vision. Bless you on your journey.
Not yet, Bridget. You're not on screen yet. You're not on screen yet, Bridget. Give me 1 second.
Thank you.
And you're going to be on screen 5, 4, 3, 2.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Thank you for being on this journey with us, for helping guide us through it. Every step is a gift and a challenge to be and build that beloved community. So thank you so much. I want to just remind everyone that you can always go, and you should now, to check the schedule at fcnl.org/AM schedule so that you can find the next sessions coming up. We are running a little bit later than the program schedule, but there will be a short break with music. Please do take a break, walk around, stretch a bit, and we will be moving into 2 options for your next sessions. For general committee members, please join our first meeting for worship with a concern for business. And if you're not on the general committee, there is an alternative session, which I would love to be at, with Amelia Keegan, talking about the COVID-19 crisis and responding to that. So you have that option as well. Thank you very much for being with us. We will take a short break now, and we look forward to seeing you in one of those 2 sessions. Thank you, friends.